Right now, somewhere, a man is on one knee holding a small stone that took roughly 150 million years to form. And he has been told his whole life that this stone should cost him 2 months of his salary. That number did not come from geology. It did not come from scarcity. It came from an advertising agency in New York in 1947. Here is the strange part. Diamonds are not actually rare, not in the way you have been led to believe. And the story of how a common stone became the most emotionally loaded purchase in the world is one of the strangest cases of manufactured belief in modern history. To understand how strange, you first have to understand what a diamond actually is. Diamonds are pure carbon, crystallized under extreme heat and pressure, roughly 90 to 150 miles beneath the Earth's surface, then carried upward by violent volcanic eruptions millions of years ago, through narrow geological pipes that geologists call kimberlite pipes, named after the very town at the center of this story. Geologically speaking, diamonds are common. They are found on every continent except Antarctica, in Africa, in Russia, in Canada, in Australia, in Brazil. There is no global shortage of diamonds sitting in the ground. The scarcity you have been sold is not a fact of nature. It is, as you will see, a business decision made by a small number of men in a small number of rooms. But to understand how that decision got made, and how it built an empire, funded wars, and is now falling apart in real time, we have to go back to the 1860s, to a riverbank in southern Africa. This is the story of how a 15-year-old boy's discovery on a farm turned into a monopoly that controlled up to 90% of the world's diamond trade, how that monopoly manufactured the very idea of the diamond engagement ring, how it financed some of the bloodiest civil wars of the late 20th century, and how right now, in 2026, the whole system it built is collapsing under the weight of a laboratory machine that can grow the exact same stone in weeks. We are going to trace every domino from a farmhouse in South Africa to a jewelry counter near you, and we are going to meet the people who built this illusion, the people who profited from it, and the people who paid for it with their limbs and their lives. Before any of that, diamonds already had a long, quiet history, one that had nothing to do with romance at all. The earliest known diamonds were mined in central India more than 2,000 years ago, sifted by hand from the gravel beds of the Krishna and Godavari river valleys. For most of human history, India was the only real source of diamonds on Earth. They were prized not for love, but for their hardness and their strange, unearthly brilliance, a stone that could scratch any other substance known to exist. Sanskrit texts describe them as objects of near mystical power, capable of protecting their owner from harm or channeling divine energy. And Indian traders classified diamonds by caste, associating certain stones with certain social ranks, as though the gem itself carried social status before it ever reached a Western hand. Traders carried these stones west along ancient caravan routes into Persia and eventually into Europe, where they remained exotic curiosities, owned almost exclusively by royalty and the extremely wealthy. There was no mass market. There could not be. Supply was tiny, and for centuries, nobody had figured out how to cut a diamond in a way that made it truly sparkle. So early diamonds looked more like dull glass than the fire you see in a modern ring. That began to change in the 1400s, when European cutters in Antwerp and Bruges developed early faceting techniques that finally coaxed the light out of the stone. And it changed again dramatically in the 1700s, when Brazil, of all places, entered the picture. In 1725, gold prospectors panning riverbeds in Minas Gerais, Brazil, stumbled onto diamond deposits while searching for something else entirely. Within a few decades, Brazil had overtaken India as the world's leading diamond source, and for more than a century, it stayed that way, shipping stones back to Lisbon and onto the royal courts of Europe. But even Brazil's output was modest by modern standards, measured in thousands of carats a year, not millions. Diamonds remained a luxury reserved for aristocrats and monarchs. Nobody yet imagined a stone as an ordinary middle-class purchase. That idea did not exist. It had not been invented. Then, in 1866, everything changed on a farm on the banks of the Orange River in what is now South Africa. A child playing near the riverbank picked up a heavy, oddly shiny pebble and brought it home. It ended up in the hands of a neighboring farmer, who eventually had it examined by experts. It was a 21-carat diamond, later named the Eureka diamond. A few years later, an even larger stone turned up nearby. A stone so impressive it was displayed at the Paris exhibition and stunned European jewelers who had never seen African diamonds before. Word spread across the world within months. Prospectors poured in from Britain, from Europe, from as far away as Australia, and by 1871 diggers had found an extraordinary concentration of diamonds packed into a single hill, near what would become the town of Kimberley. Thousands of men began digging by hand in small individual claims measured in just a few square feet each, working side by side in narrow trenches, racing to pull stones out of the ground before anyone else did. And this is where the problem began. The Kimberley fields were not producing a trickle of diamonds. They were producing an avalanche. Within a few years, diggers had carved out what became known as the Big Hole, one of the largest hand-dug excavations on Earth, eventually reaching hundreds of feet deep and stretching across dozens of acres, all of it dug with picks, shovels, and buckets on ropes. Diamonds that had once been the rarest luxury goods in the world were suddenly pouring out of the ground by the ton. If that supply had reached the market freely, diamond prices would have collapsed within a few short years. A stone that had symbolized untouchable wealth for 2,000 years was on the verge of becoming nearly worthless, simply because there was too much of it. This is the part most people never learn. The people digging at Kimberley figured out faster than anyone expected exactly how to stop that collapse from happening. They started buying each other out. Small claim holders sold to slightly larger operators, who sold to even larger syndicates, consolidating dozens, then hundreds, of individual diggings into a handful of powerful companies that could control how many stones reached buyers at any given time. It was intuitive economics, discovered under pressure by men who understood one basic truth long before any economist wrote it down. Whoever controlled the flow of diamonds out of the ground controlled their price. One of those men was a young, sickly English immigrant named Cecil Rhodes, who had come to South Africa originally for his health, and started out as a small-time claim holder, renting steam pumps to drain water out of other men's mines rather than digging himself. Rhodes was relentless. He bought out competitor after competitor, borrowed heavily from banking houses in London, formed partnerships he later dissolved on his own terms, and squeezed out rivals one by one over nearly 2 decades. In 1888, in a deal financed with the backing of the Rothschild banking family, Rhodes merged his holdings with those of his last major competitor, a flamboyant dealer named Barney Barnato, to form De Beers Consolidated Mines, named after the farm where the very first Kimberley claims had been staked. Within a few years, De Beers controlled somewhere close to 90% of the world's rough diamond production. A stone that nature had made common had been made artificially scarce by one company's decision to control the tap. Here is why that mattered so much. Once De Beers controlled the vast majority of the world's diamond supply, it did not need diamonds to actually be rare. It only needed the world to believe they were rare. De Beers began deliberately stockpiling diamonds in vaults in London, rather than selling them, releasing only carefully calculated quantities each year. Just enough to satisfy demand without ever flooding the market and driving prices down. Prices stayed high, year after year, decade after decade. Not because of geology, but because one company had made itself the sole gatekeeper of supply. This single decision, made in the 1880s by a handful of men in one boardroom, is the direct ancestor of every diamond price tag you have ever seen in a jewelry store window. From Kimberley, that model of control spread outward across the entire world. De Beers didn't just buy mines in South Africa. It built a global distribution arm, eventually known as the Central Selling Organization, based in London. which purchased rough diamonds from producers around the world, including from mines it did not even own, in places like Namibia, Botswana, and later Russia, and funneled nearly all of them through a single controlled channel. Roughly 10 times a year, De Beers would invite a small, hand-picked group of approved buyers, known within the trade as site holders, to view a pre-arranged box of rough stones at a fixed price. Buyers were not permitted to negotiate. They could accept the box exactly as offered, or refuse it entirely and risk losing their invitation forever. By the middle of the 20th century, De Beers was said to control somewhere between 80 and 90% of the entire global rough diamond trade. A company born from one man's consolidation of a few dozen African mining claims had become the single most powerful gatekeeper of a commodity on the planet. But diamonds were not only building a monopoly, they were also quietly building an empire. This is a detour worth taking because it explains why South Africa's colonial history and the modern diamond trade are so tightly intertwined. Cecil Rhodes did not stop at diamonds. He used his enormous diamond fortune to fund the British South Africa Company and to push colonial expansion deep into Central Africa, sending armed columns north to seize territory that would eventually be named, quite literally, after him: Rhodesia. Diamond wealth helped bankroll British imperial ambition across an entire region of the continent, funding treaties, private armies, and railway lines that reshaped borders and governments that still exist, under different names, today. Rhodes also became Prime Minister of the Cape Colony, using political power to pass legislation that restricted black land ownership and voting rights, laws that historians now trace directly forward to the machinery of apartheid decades later. A stone dug out of one farmer's field in 1866 had, within a generation, helped redraw the map of Africa and shape its politics for a century to come. If you are finding this story interesting so far, this is a good moment to hit subscribe, because the parts coming up, the ones involving war, cover-ups, and a laboratory machine quietly ending a 100-year monopoly, are even stranger than what you have heard already. By the late 20th century, the diamond trade had a much darker secret, one the industry spent years trying not to talk about. Starting in the 1990s, rebel armies in several African nations discovered that diamonds made an almost perfect currency for war. Unlike cash, rough diamonds are small, easy to smuggle across borders, nearly impossible to trace, and hold enormous value relative to their size. A handful of stones worth more than a truckload of any other good. In Sierra Leone, the Revolutionary United Front seized control of diamond-producing regions in the east of the country and used the proceeds to buy weapons on the black market, fueling a civil war that lasted more than a decade and claimed tens of thousands of lives. The rebels became infamous for a campaign of deliberate amputations, chopping off the hands and arms of civilians, including children, as a tool of terror, designed to prevent people from voting or working in a conflict funded almost entirely by stones that would eventually be cut, polished, and sold as symbols of love on the other side of the world. Similar patterns played out in Angola, where UNITA rebels used diamond revenue to continue fighting long after the Cold War funding that had originally sustained them dried up, and in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where diamond wealth financed rival factions and prolonged some of the deadliest fighting since the Second World War. Industry estimates suggest that at the height of these conflicts in the mid to late 1990s, so-called conflict diamonds, or blood diamonds, may have accounted for as much as 15% of the world's entire rough diamond trade. For years, the diamond industry downplayed how large the problem really was, insisting the conflict trade was a marginal issue affecting only a handful of failed states. That began to change in 1998 when the watchdog organization Global Witness published a report titled A Rough Trade. laying out in painstaking detail how diamond revenue was funding the Angolan Civil War and naming specific companies involved in the trade. Journalists and human rights groups picked up the thread quickly, and public pressure mounted fast, amplified by news footage of amputee camps in Sierra Leone. The major diamond companies, De Beers included, initially resisted the idea that their supply chains were tainted, arguing the scale was smaller than reports suggested, and that responsibility lay with rebel groups alone. But the evidence and the outrage kept growing until the industry could no longer avoid it. The fix that eventually emerged was the Kimberley Process certification scheme, launched in 2003, named, with a certain grim irony, after the same South African town where the modern diamond trade had begun more than a century earlier. Under the scheme, participating countries agreed to certify that exported rough diamonds were conflict-free before they could enter the legitimate international market, backed by government export certificates and international monitoring. It was hailed at the time as a landmark achievement, a rare case of an entire global industry policing itself under public pressure. But critics have pointed out for years that the Kimberley Process has serious gaps. It defines conflict diamonds narrowly, focused specifically on revenue raised by rebel groups fighting recognized governments, which means diamonds tied to state violence or forced labor carried out by a government itself, as happened later in Zimbabwe's Morange fields, can still pass through the system labeled clean. Sound familiar? It is the same pattern seen again and again across other industries. A reform arrives, is celebrated with fanfare, and turns out to solve only part of the problem it was built to fix. While the industry was quietly managing its conflict problem, it was also running one of the most successful marketing campaigns in advertising history, one that had started decades earlier and shaped how the entire world thinks about diamonds. In the 1930s, diamond sales in the United States had slumped badly during the Great Depression, and De Beers hired the advertising agency N.W. Ayer to solve the problem. The agency's solution was not to lower prices, it was to change what a diamond meant. Ayer's campaign linked diamonds directly to romantic love and permanent commitment, placing diamond rings in Hollywood films, persuading movie stars to wear them in public appearances, and running magazine advertisements that showed diamonds not as investments, but as irreplaceable emotional symbols, precisely because a used diamond ring could not easily be resold for what it cost. In 1947, a young copywriter at the agency coined a slogan that would outlive the century: "A diamond is forever." Soon after, the agency began pushing a very specific idea into popular culture. The notion that a man should spend roughly 1 month's salary, later stretched deliberately to 2 months, on an engagement ring. There was no tradition behind that number. It was invented whole cloth by an advertising agency to make an artificially scarce product feel like an unquestionable rite of passage rather than a discretionary purchase. It worked extraordinarily well. Diamond engagement ring sales in the United States soared through the 1950s and 60s, and the campaign was exported abroad, adapted for markets in Japan, where diamond engagement rings had barely existed before the 1960s and became nearly universal within a generation. Within a generation, an entire culture had absorbed a marketing slogan as if it were ancient custom, and De Beers had converted its artificial scarcity into something even more powerful: emotional necessity. But here is the part the industry worked very hard to keep quiet. De Beers' control of the diamond trade was not simply clever business. For much of the 20th century, regulators in multiple countries considered it a textbook illegal cartel. The company was so aware of this exposure that for decades, it deliberately avoided doing direct business inside the United States, specifically to stay outside the reach of American antitrust law, conducting sales through intermediaries instead. It was not until 2004 that De Beers finally pleaded guilty to price-fixing charges in the United States. agreeing to pay roughly $10 million to settle a decades-old case tied to industrial diamond sales, a case that had stretched back to the 1940s. The company that had spent a century insisting diamonds were naturally inherently rare had in its own legal filings effectively admitted that the rarity was managed, and the underlying fact never changed. Diamonds are not geologically scarce. The scarcity was built on purpose by a company that controlled the tap. Now, the challenger has arrived, and it is not another mining company. It is a machine. Lab-grown diamonds, chemically and structurally identical to mined stones, are grown in facilities using high-pressure and high-temperature methods that recreate the conditions found deep underground, or a newer process called chemical vapor deposition, which builds a diamond layer by layer inside a plasma chamber, and modern lab-grown stones are, to standard gemological testing equipment, indistinguishable from anything pulled out of the ground except by specialized machines built specifically to detect the difference. The shift has been staggering. As recently as 2018, lab-grown diamonds made up roughly 3% of engagement ring center stones sold in the United States. By 2026, that figure had climbed to roughly 52%, meaning more than half of American engagement rings now use a stone grown in a lab rather than mined from the earth. De Beers, the company that built the entire idea of diamond scarcity, has been forced to cut its official rough diamond prices for the first time in over a year, and has slashed its production guidance by more than a third, from around 30 to 33 million carats down to 20 to 23 million carats. The company that once controlled the tap can no longer control the faucet it built its empire on. De Beers' response has not been to compete on price. It has been to pivot to authenticity. The company has poured resources into a blockchain traceability platform called Tracer, designed to certify that a stone is genuinely mined and not lab-grown. And in mid-2026, the Geological Institute of America agreed to buy a 30% stake in the platform, lending it outside credibility it could not generate on its own. It is a striking reversal. For more than 100 years, the diamond industry sold scarcity. Now it is selling proof of origin because the scarcity itself has stopped being convincing on its own. Zoom out, and the global picture is a study in contradiction. Natural diamond production has fallen to multi-decade lows, hovering around 100 million carats in 2025, a sharp drop from where it stood only a few years earlier. And yet, at the very same time, the broader diamond category, powered almost entirely by lab-grown stones, is booming, with the lab-grown diamond market valued at more than $30 billion in 2026 and still growing at a double-digit rate every year, projected by several industry analysts to nearly triple in size before the end of the decade. Both things are true simultaneously. The natural diamond industry is shrinking, and diamonds as an idea, as a product category, have never been bigger. There is one country that breaks almost every simple version of this story: India. India is not just where diamonds were first mined in ancient times. It is now the beating heart of the modern diamond trade in an almost entirely different role. More than 90% of the world's diamonds by volume pass through cutting and polishing workshops in the city of Surat, in the western Indian state of Gujarat, employing hundreds of thousands of workers who transform rough, dull stones into the faceted gems that eventually reach jewelry counters worldwide. And, in a twist that would have been unthinkable a generation ago, India has also become one of the fastest growing manufacturing hubs for lab-grown diamonds themselves, with entire factories now dedicated to growing stones rather than cutting mined ones. The same country where diamonds entered human history more than 2,000 years ago is now simultaneously polishing the mined past and manufacturing the synthetic future, sometimes on the very same streets, in workshops a few blocks apart. Not every diamond nation has followed South Africa's path either. Consider Botswana, a country that took an almost completely different economic road. After gaining independence from Britain in 1966, the same year diamonds were discovered within its own borders. Rather than allowing a single foreign company to extract and control its diamond wealth outright, Botswana's government entered a 50-50 ownership partnership with De Beers through a joint venture called Debswana, using its share of diamond revenue to fund roads, schools, and healthcare on a scale that made it one of post-colonial Africa's strongest economic success stories, transforming what was once among the poorest countries on the continent into an upper-middle-income economy within a few decades. Compare that to Russia, where the state-controlled company Alrosa emerged as De Beers' great rival, mining vast reserves in the frozen ground of Siberia, including the enormous Mir mine, and eventually surpassing De Beers in raw output, proving that the old monopoly could be challenged not just by a laboratory, but by an entirely different kind of state-run competitor operating under an entirely different political system. Diamonds did not just build one empire, they built several along wildly different paths, from a nationalized development story in Botswana, to a state mining giant in Russia, to a private cartel born on a South African riverbank. Think back to where this story started. A farmer's child picking up a strange, heavy pebble on the banks of the Orange River in 1866. A young immigrant named Cecil Rhodes buying out claim after claim until he controlled nearly the whole supply, then using that fortune to carve a colony out of Central Africa and put his name on the map. A company vault in London deliberately holding diamonds back from the market to keep them expensive. An advertising agency inventing the phrase, "a diamond is forever." And inventing, right alongside it, the idea that love should be measured in months of salary. Rebel armies in Sierra Leone trading stones for guns and the amputations that funded them. A Kimberley Process built to fix that horror, with loopholes still built into its foundation. A guilty plea decades in the making, quietly admitting what geologists had said all along, that diamonds were never actually that rare. Botswana choosing partnership over extraction, and Russia building a rival empire out of Siberian permafrost. And now, a laboratory machine, growing the exact same crystal in a matter of weeks, dismantling in a single decade a monopoly that took more than 100 years to build. That man on one knee holding a stone he was told should cost 2 months of his salary has no idea he is standing at the very end of a story that started on a riverbank 160 years ago. The stone in his hand might be pulled from deep underground, or it might have been grown in a warehouse a few weeks earlier. Chemically, there is no difference between the two at all. The only thing that ever made one version of that stone worth more than the other was a story told extraordinarily well by extraordinarily few people for an extraordinarily long time. If this changed the way you think about the diamond in your own life or someone else's, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments whether you had any idea the scarcity was invented.